Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fall YU Book Talk series. Tonight, Dr. Edward Hoffman will discuss Maimonides, Pioneer of Positive Psychology. The event is co-sponsored by the J. and Jeannie Schottenstein Honors Program. Dr. Hoffman has written several books, including The Wisdom of Maimonides, The Life and Writings of the Jewish Sage, as well as Positive Psychology, The Science of Happiness and Flourishing, co-authored by W.C. Compton. Please feel free to enter your questions or comments in the chat during the presentation. Welcome, Dr. Hoffman.
Good evening. I'd like to say that I'm honored to have this opportunity to lead the book series this year. I just began teaching a couple of weeks ago at Yeshiva College again in psychology. And this is a topic that I find fascinating and very inspiring. It's been a very rough year for the Jewish people all over the world. And I contacted the book series director because I felt this is a positive contribution that I could make, showing the historical continuity of the Jewish people, of great Jewish thinkers, and giving us comfort to realize the long history of the Jewish people with its ups and downs in the world. And I felt this would be a nice topic. It combines both Jewish studies and psychology, and these have been two of my intellectual passions for many decades. So I'll jump into the topic, and having only an hour is not a lot of time. I could spend hours on this subject because it touches almost all aspects of our lives. And I do want to have some time for questions or comments if you have them in the audience. So please understand I can only address highlights of this very important topic of positive psychology and some of the insights of the Rambam concerning this area of human knowledge. My guess is that those of you outside of psychology only have a very vague notion of what positive psychology is. So I think it's important for me to spend a few minutes kind of highlighting, and then we'll move into the ideas of the Rambam. So positive psychology was launched in 1998 by Professor Martin Seligman. He was president of the American Psychological Association at the time. By coincidence, he was one of my professors at Cornell University when I was an undergrad, and he was very young at that time. He was a clinical psychologist, and he's had a career opening up new areas of psychology. The field itself goes back earlier to the work of Alfred Adler, who might be considered the grandfather. I wrote the major biography of Adler a number of years ago, and I was greatly influenced by his thinking. Abraham Maslow also can be considered one of the early grandfathers or fathers of the field of positive psychology. He wrote a book in the 1950s in which he had a chapter called Toward a Positive Psychology. That was 70 years ago in 1954. So since the post-World War II era, there's been an interest. What does positive psychology mean? It basically comes from the notion that clinical psychology and personality theory were founded by medical doctors. Everyone has heard of Sigmund Freud. He was a medical doctor. Adler was a medical doctor. Carl Jung was a medical doctor. Those were the three founders of the modern field of personality theory and clinical psychology: Adler, Freud, and Jung. And in the 1920s and 1930s, they were world famous. They were interviewed by newspapers. There was no television then, radio was just beginning. But everyone in the Western world who was educated heard of Jung, Adler, and Freud. They may not have read their books, which were technical, but they knew something about their ideas. Now, because they were medical doctors, they focused more on pathology, psychopathology, and abnormal behavior. And this makes sense. If you are not feeling well, if you're feeling sick, you see a doctor. If you're feeling healthy, except maybe for a checkup, you don't see a doctor. So this is true in clinical psychology also. They tend to see people who have psychological problems like depression, anxiety, phobias, social anxieties. So the field for many years was oriented towards dysfunction and pathology. So I tell my students at Yeshiva College when we talk about healthy families, we'll be getting into that in my course in a few weeks. If you only look at Hollywood movies or TV shows, you would think that all we have are dysfunctional families. Families where parents hate their kids, kids hate their parents, siblings don't get along. And of course, this is not true at all. So Martin Seligman, and in the 20 years since he launched positive psychology, has been looking at the opposite side of the spectrum. Healthy functioning, individual healthy functioning, what makes for people's happiness. In positive psychology and now in clinical psychology, we call this subjective well-being. That is, what makes for people to feel happy, to feel good about themselves, what makes for healthy families, what makes for healthy groups of people, institutions like high schools and colleges. And in 20 years, we know much more than when the field was started. One of the contributions of Seligman and his founders was to do empirical research. So we know much more about what makes for resilience. Probably everyone in the audience has heard this term. It means the ability to bounce back from stress, from upsetting situations, and to cope with these things very well. We also know much more about what makes for flourishing. This is the term that's used now to describe healthy functioning. And so the textbook that I wrote with Dr. Bill Compton, and it's the leading college textbook in the world in positive psychology. It was just published in its fourth edition several months ago. And the subtitle is The Science of Happiness and Flourishing. So it's not only about happiness, that's a trivialization that the mass media latched onto. We look at meaning, what gives us a sense of meaning in life, and not just a sense of being happy. So, of course, we could talk about this for a long time, but I wanted everyone to have an understanding of what positive psychology is about. And we look at characteristics like gratitude, forgiveness, well-being, harmonious relationships in marriage and in family life, and so forth. So, with my interest in Jewish studies, I became interested to see how far we could go back in the field of Jewish writing and also gain insights. Some of the areas of positive psychology, for instance, look at mindfulness. Probably everyone in the audience has heard about mindfulness training. It is an important contribution. It's being taught in medical schools now all over the world in areas like pain management, dealing with anxiety, dealing with depression. It's taken very seriously. And you might be interested to know some of the founders are of Jewish background, but they drew on Buddhism, Buddhist teachings for understanding about this tradition. So my background in Jewish studies is not as good as some of the students or professors at YU. I did go to a Jewish day school, an Orthodox day school, for 6 years, and I come from a family with a great deal of interest and skill in Jewish music, going back probably 170 years in Eastern Europe, of well-known cantors and musicians. So drawing on that background that I've had, I felt it would be worthwhile to look at great Jewish thinkers and what insights they could give us for positive psychology. So tonight I'd like to highlight some of the areas that I found fascinating going back to the life of Rambam 800 years ago. Many of his ideas are highly relevant to us today because human nature has not changed in 800 years. And I find this very exciting intellectually, and I do share this with my students at Yeshiva College when it's relevant in the courses that I teach. So one of the areas, and I'll highlight each of these, each we could spend more time on than what we have. One area that the Rambam emphasized is the importance of habits in forming our daily life. Probably all of you know, I learned this in yeshiva when I was in fifth grade, this concept of charity, that it's more important, let's say if someone has $1,000 to donate to charity, it's more important to give, you wouldn't want to give probably 1,000 checks of $1, but you might give 10 checks of $100 or some variation of chai to do that rather than one check for $1,000. And of course, most of you are familiar with this. And the Rambam explained this because it builds the habit of cultivating charity rather than as one bombastic act. We learn to cultivate this and to think this way. And it stemmed from his view that human beings are creatures of habit, that we are our habits in certain ways. It's a very Jewish concept that our actions are the most important thing that we do, not our thoughts. Thoughts are worthwhile, but it's what we actually do in everyday life that is the most important thing in our functioning. And this became very well understood in modern psychology. The founder of modern psychology was William James. He was a very great thinker, very great philosopher. He taught at Harvard the last few decades of his life. And he founded the field of psychology in this country. And he had a very famous comment that habit is the flywheel of society. This is what makes civilization go. We all have our daily habits. And so the Rambam emphasized hundreds and hundreds of years before William James in the 20th century, the importance in two areas of cultivating good habits, okay, and not cultivating bad habits. Good meaning habits that contribute to the well-being of the community and other people, and bad habits meaning behaving in ways that are unethical and that harm people psychologically and perhaps physically in their lives. He emphasized that the key is repetition. So that's why this example of charity is so important. It's important to get into the mindset of positive attributes in daily life. Now, this has very broad implications, which is very relevant to positive psychology. In other words, what the Rambam is saying is that the little things make a difference, what we do in everyday life, not grandiose, bombastic things. Not that they're necessarily bad, but that's really not what our character is about. And there's some fascinating implications that are coming out now in positive psychology. They don't know about the Rambam yet. Maybe if they hear me lecture or if they read my material, because it hasn't had a wide impact yet in positive psychology. But let me give you a couple of examples. Positive psychologists study marriage and well-being in marriage. So not dysfunction. We know lots about what makes marriages miserable and makes people want to leave their spouse. But very little research has been done until recently about what makes people still in love with their spouse after 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years or more. And this is starting to be studied. And what we find is that the Rambam's concept is very relevant to this. When people feel close to their spouse and say that they are very happily married, it's not the single bombastic things that make a difference, like taking a lavish vacation somewhere for 10 days or 2 weeks. There's nothing wrong with that, and I'm certainly not saying that that's harmful for the marriage. But what people report when they say they're very happily married is the little things, feeling acts of kindness performed by their spouse. Things that seem very simple, picking up the other person's laundry at the dry cleaners, going to the supermarket when the other person feels tired and isn't in the mood to do that. It's these little things that make a difference in how happy people feel in their marriage. And this is a very important point because most married people want to have close marriages. A second point that I became aware of just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal had a front page article that because of the transition in work from working in person to a hybrid now, and this may be for some of you in the audience may work a hybrid situation, meaning that you work at home part of the week and then you work in person for part of the week. It turns out that those people are the most unhappy about their work situations. They say that they feel isolated working at home. There are benefits they get, but they feel social isolation. But when they come to the office, they're at meetings all day long, and the meetings aren't what they used to be. They're very stiff, very formal. The reason because they're not seeing these people elsewhere during the week, and everything has to be crammed in on the 2 days that they're in person or 3 days. So there's no time to schmooze, to relax, to unwind, and they leave their workplace not feeling very satisfied. And furthermore, what they report that they miss the most are the interactions, proverbially at the water cooler, light conversations where you feel a sense of closeness to people. So to me, that's an interesting finding, and it reinforces the view that daily habits make a big deal of difference to our psychological well-being. Not the bombastic once in a year activities, but the simple things. A third area, which gets into what affects our mental and physical health, are called daily hassles, the psychology of daily hassles. And what this means is little things that upset you or bother you in daily life tend to build up and to undermine your mental and physical well being. And this has been extended now to looking at parenting. What kind of hassles do people experience as parents? Now, there are always hassles, and most people find that the benefits or the joy of being a parent outweighs the negative aspects. But people do need to pay attention to these daily hassles, not once in a year, once every 10 years, very, very stressful situations, but little things of stress. And the researchers have found that they add up. One of the researchers looked at longevity, life expectancy, in terms of older people and the number of hassles that they report. And it turns out that the more little hassles you have as you get older, the more it undermines your physical health and presumably your mental health as well. The people who had more reported hassles died earlier than the ones who had fewer reported hassles. A hassle could be uh, you have a long commute and it just is exhausting to you, or that you don't get support from your family. Nothing devastating. These are not people who are clinically depressed or anything like that. They're normal people in everyday life. And we vary in how many hassles we experience. And I quoted the researcher at the end of one of her studies saying that it turned out that, quote, it's the little things that do you in. It's not the major catastrophes based on her research. So in those three areas, we see this insight of the Rambam that how we function in daily life, what kind of habits you cultivate, really can make a difference to your sense of well-being mentally and physically. When I teach positive psychology at Yeshiva College, this is a course that I founded about 10 years ago. One of the activities I have with my students is I break them up into small groups and ask them to discuss what are their daily hassles and to get advice from their classmates about what strategies they can use to lower or minimize these hassles. And I think the students find this very useful. So that's one point that is, I think, a great insight that the Rambam had, the importance of cultivating good habits and trying to reduce the bad habits in our life. Of course, he was a physician. He wasn't just a theorist. He treated thousands of people, and he was considered one of the greatest medical practitioners of his time. So I greatly value his insights because these were not simply theoretical insights, but based on his experience with Jewish people and non-Jews that he treated in the royal court in the Islamic world. A second point he emphasized is that human beings are social beings, that we're greatly influenced by our social environment. We are affected by our peers, by our neighbors, by the larger community. We can't possibly accurately think that we're not going to be affected. Even reading a newspaper, I believe this as a psychologist. All of us, when we read a couple of weeks ago about that 14-year-old boy who murdered two classmates and two teachers in his school, I think we've all followed this. He's been arrested, his father, and so forth. We're affected by this. I think we'd have to be a robot if we're reading this in a newspaper and feel nothing, there's something wrong with us. It has an effect on us. So that's part of our social milieu. We are affected by terrible events going on in the world that we hear about, that we read about, that we may see. And from the positive standpoint, we can be uplifted by positive events. There's a whole body of knowledge now that looks at how we're uplifted by positive events that happen to us. And it's in the Jewish tradition also. Let me just bring out some of the ideas that we see in the teachings of the Rambam. He recognized the existence of temperament. And if I have any students listening, we just covered this in the first week of the course in child psychology. Temperament is the biological basis of personality, what we're born with, what we come into the world with. And he recognized this. He was a very perceptive medical doctor. And he talked about this very poetically. He said, some people are born with great courage. They will go into battle and they will defend their community, their family, and they're fearless. And other people are cowardly and are very, very timid. And that is their temperament. He said some people are very generous by nature. They let other people visit their homes. They're very hospitable. They may not have a huge amount of money, but they give to charity. And other people with more money are miserly and very stingy, very unhospitable, and give very little or nothing to charity. And he gave examples of this. So he understood that there is temperament. And of course, through genetics, we know much more about the science of temperament. But he emphasized that we are influenced by our social environment. And he felt that this was very important. Some of his teachings are things that I learned when I was studying as a child in yeshiva. So For instance, he talked about the importance of surrounding ourselves with good friends, people of a high moral quality, high ethical quality. We may start out at a higher moral and ethical level, but we can be brought down by the company of other people, people who are selfish, who are immoral, who care very little for other people, care very little uh, for their neighbors, for their community. So he felt this was very important to surround yourself with good people. He talked about the importance of having a mentor and a teacher. Surprisingly, he said if you can't find one, then pay to have one, to pay to have a mentor. That's how important it is. Not so much teaching academic skills, but teaching character development at all times in your life. I became very interested in this topic of um, mentorship. And I've been interested in writing a book about it because in my own life, I have been very lucky, very fortunate to have wonderful mentors, starting in high school, continuing in college and graduate school, and then in my academic career and my career as a writer as well. Um, One of the things when we talk about the shift in work is that people are losing the opportunity to have mentors. If you work at home all day long, and there are some definite advantages, I won't deny that. No one likes commuting, especially in an area like New York or Boston or Washington. You can spend 2 to 3 hours a day commuting, and it's probably not good for your physical health. But you isolate yourself from a mentor if you're just sitting in front of your screen and doing your work that way. I was talking with one of my colleagues that mentorship may even be disappearing then for young people, people in their 20s or early 30s, who will say they have no mentor. They can't think of anyone who's been a mentor. And it also means that they will not be mentors when they get older because they won't have had the experience of what it's like in this relationship. So again, the Rambam talked about the importance of surrounding yourself with good friends, people who uplift you socially, the importance of teachers, and the importance of mentors. All of these influence your positive development. He also said, and he wrote this in a letter to his son, it was an ethical will. Some of you know this is a very important part of the Jewish tradition of it could essentially fathers, but certainly it can be mothers writing advice to their grown children about how to lead their lives when they're no longer here. And he talked about rejecting bad influences. I think every parent wants their teenage son or daughter to reject bad influences. And I think we live in a culture where this is much more pernicious than when I was growing up because of the existence of social media, the internet, and so forth. And one of the things I learned in yeshiva, which has always stayed with me, and I've shared this with my colleagues, is his teaching that if you live in an area where there are no ethical people, no moral people, then you move, you have to leave. He did this in his life. He went from place to place for the first half of his life. And he said, if you can find no place to live where you're surrounded by ethical and moral people, then you must go live in a cave and isolate yourself lest you become like them. So I learned that when I was 10 years old, and it's been a fundamental value to me. I've taught this to my children, and I think they're very familiar with this. Uh, so this one is a very important concept that positive psychology is now starting to recognize. There's an area which it might surprise you. Um, Thomas Jefferson, one of our early presidents, knew about this concept in his own experience. It's the experience of being morally uplifted when people do something very wonderful, when they do an act of goodness for other people. If you see it or even hear about it, It can be in a movie, in a book. It could be a real event where someone does something extremely moral and ethical and uplifting. And sometimes people have tears when they hear this. And it's not tears of sadness, it's a peculiar kind of emotion. I've published several studies on tears of joy, and I've looked at these kinds of experiences when people have tears from happiness, not from sadness. But this has been part of the Jewish tradition also. And it's a very real phenomena. It's something that I think children and teenagers can be exposed to, of uplifting them by hearing about very moral and very ethical acts that people, sometimes even everyday people, do in their lives. Okay. A third area that the Rambam's teachings I found very important are the importance of developing good social skills. Um, as I mentioned, this is an area that positive psychology is doing a lot with. Alfred Adler was one of the first thinkers to talk about the importance of training children to have very positive social skills involving empathy, sensitivity to feelings of others, being trustworthy, uh, having integrity, being honest, and so forth. Um, the Rambam knew that we're not born with these skills, that they have to be developed and cultivated. And I found in many of his writings on the Mishnah, for example, Pirkei Avot, this was a very important theme to him, of learning. I called it in my book chapter, learning to be a sage, that they're actual specific behaviors that people at a young age can cultivate to develop better social skills. Some people are more introverted, they're more shy. I think every professor knows this. Some very good, bright students just never participate. They are too shy to get engaged in the class. My father taught high school English at the Bronx High School of Science for many years, and he was a very popular teacher, very admired. Even 40 years after students had him, they still remembered him. And he once told me that if you have a student like this who is doing well in the class but just doesn't participate, you have to call on them. And he said to me, you have to break the ice. And okay, they won't enjoy it at that moment, but it won't destroy them, most likely. And then they'll be more comfortable about speaking. We have a responsibility. We're the adults, we're the teachers. We have to bring them out of their shell, so to speak. And I think this is an important point that's consistent with the Rambam's teachings, is we all can learn to develop our social skills to be more empathic and more sensitive to the feelings of others. And this is a very important area of educational psychology today, when we have children or teenagers or even adults who have poor social skills, helping them to develop these kinds of abilities. Um, so if this sounds vague to you, some of the specifics that the Rambam talked about, and if you have a yeshiva background, it probably wouldn't surprise you. He talked about the importance of being articulate, of not over talking, not talking when you have nothing to say. He said, speak sparingly, carefully, and be articulate when you have something to contribute. These are the elements that are important. Also, if you had my kind of background, you learned never to shame anyone. He said, once you utter a word, you can't take it back. So this is something that was drummed in to my head and my small group of classmates. There were about 15 or 16 of us. We learned this concept that if you shame someone in public, it's tantamount to killing their soul. It can be very harmful to their well-being and things that people remember decades later. Um, he talked about the importance of avoiding gossip, bad-mouthing other people, slandering other people. All of these, of course, are part of the Jewish tradition. They not only come from his teachings, but the fact that he was such a great scholar, a great mind and thinker, emphasizing this, I think, is very significant. And of course, the importance of being socially connected to other people. Um, he was devoted to his family. Some of you may know his brother was a merchant and died in a shipwreck. And the Rambam then had to take the responsibility of caring financially, not only for his own family, but for his brother's family. And he did this without complaining. He accepted this was what God wanted him to do, and he took on this responsibility. So I found that very significant. Uh, you know from the introduction that I've written biographies, and in my work on the Rambam, I had a biographical section in the book to kind of trace his life from birth through death and understand what were the key elements of his own life, and that way to understand what things he emphasized. A fourth element, and I think we're at 7 after 8, so I'll try to wrap up in about 10 minutes. A fourth element, he looked at our feelings. In psychology, we call this affect. And the advice he gave his son and in other writings was the importance of avoiding anger. He felt that anger was a very destructive type of feeling. And when people are born with a tendency to anger, which he recognized, that's a flaw that they have to work on in particular. That not sadness and not jealousy, there are different kinds of negative emotions that all human beings can have, and we all vary in that. But he felt that anger was the single most destructive one. As some of you may know, he also talked about how to achieve higher states of consciousness, what we would call the prophetic state. And he believed that all human beings have the potential to become closer to God, to reach the state of higher consciousness. But he said, if you want to reach that state, you have to minimize anger. You have to root it out. More than any other feeling, it brings us down from a state of higher consciousness. So I found that very interesting because in psychology, we know now that it's very destructive, not only to the mind, but to the body. Those of you in the medical field or in the health field know that people who are chronically angry, it affects the cardiovascular system. You're always tense. You're always feeling stress. You can't trust people in that state also, because everything they do angers you. And I think we don't have time to go into this in this presentation. He understood very well the mind-body relationship, which is becoming more and more important, not only in psychology, but in the health field in general. So this emphasis on trying to avoid negative emotions, dealing with them, why I say avoid, not suppress them, but to bring them out into the open and dissipate them as much as possible, that this is better for your physical health as well. And in the field of psychology, my discipline, there's a growing field. It's based in the California area called somatic psychology. I've become very interested in that in the last couple of years. It came about by studying people with PTSD. The notion is that the trauma is not simply in their brain, but it's stored in their body. It's stored in their muscles, in their shoulders, in their stomach, in their chests. And the focus then is getting those feelings recognized and through physical acts, through people who are trained in this, discharging the trauma that is in their body. People who are victims of rape and physical assault, terrorism, and so forth. The PTSD is not just in their mind, it's stored in their bodies. So my insight, no one really has paid attention to it yet, but I'm kind of exaggerating. Some of my colleagues are. If the traumatic feelings are stored in our bodies, which the consensus is that this is true, why can't the positive feelings, feelings of joy that we have in life, they're stored in our bodies too. Maybe we suppress them also, and we can bring them out into the open. So this is a new area that I'm exploring in my own theoretical development. But this emphasis on the mind-body unity is very clear in the Rambam's writings. Okay, and to finish up, and we will have a little time then for comments. As I began tonight, there's a lot of emphasis on mindfulness training. As I said, it's being taught in hundreds of medical schools now. I'm giving this advice to some of my friends. As people get older, the body starts to break down and pain becomes more important. And they're finding that, especially in pain management, mindfulness is very important. It may seem paradoxical. How does that reduce pain by focusing on your body? Well, it does, but you go into the emotion. You don't run from it. You accept it and you try to transform it. So it's a whole field of training. That's why it's taught in medical schools. It's not taught on the sidewalk or on the street. There's a field of training, of theory and practice involved. And as I said, most of the founders of mindfulness training are Jewish by birth, but became interested in Buddhism, and they brought it into their field of psychology. And in my textbook, we have a lot of writing about mindfulness because it is a very important part of positive psychology today. And you also find mindfulness in the Rambam's teachings. And I found that fascinating. He talked about if you want to develop your mindfulness, you can start with the prayer, the Shema. And he said, you first try to be mindful on the first few words, and gradually you develop your ability to completely focus on the here and now, on the moment, through the entire Shema, which lasts several minutes if you really focus on each word and don't rush through it. And he was using the exact concept of the importance of being in the moment, in the here and now, as we call it. The field of Gestalt therapy likes that phrase, the here and now. And that way, it improves your mental health, your ability to focus, not to dwell on the past, not to escape into the future. And also, you're more grounded in your body if you're actually in this moment, mentally and physically. So my time is kind of up right now. I hope I've touched on some areas of his thinking and shown how they relate very intimately to new areas of positive psychology today. And I'll be very happy to respond to questions and thoughts to the best of my ability in the next few minutes.
Somebody asked, they said they wondered about young people valuing experiences over things. Wouldn't a new dress for Yontif make someone happier than a vacation? Aren't there instances when possession of things takes precedence?
Well, I think based on the research in positive psychology, the research is very clear that experiences are more long lasting in affecting our well being than things. Positive experiences, we remember those rather than spending it on an object. So, but there can be exceptions, I think, around holidays that are meaningful spiritually, that ties into spiritual meaning. But just having a possession itself, that we lose the excitement pretty quickly. And that's been discussed in research.
Uh-huh. Okay, somebody actually has a question that she wants to Margalit, if you could unmute yourself. You're still muted. Oh, I don't think she could.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
So I just want to hear one or two sentences more about the fact that you said that PTSD is in their body. What do you mean by that? That they feel it physically?
Yes. Now, this isn't my area of expertise, although as a therapist, I've had people who have been in war situations and suffered PTSD. They've seen their friends, their colleagues in the army being blown up and blown to pieces. But yeah, there's a lot of research, and there are books on this now, that PTSD exists in the body, in the system of muscles that we have. It can affect different organ systems in the body. And so this is being treated by individuals who have training in this. Yeah,
Thank you.
this is called somatic psychology.
Yes,
That's the name, and it's a relatively new field.
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. How can one develop more mentors now in today's age with the computers and phones everywhere?
Well, that's a good question. If a person is in a work setting, for instance, a college student, I would encourage them to seek out professors who they think might be a mentor. And it's a complicated conversation. I published an article with Dr. Bill Compton about a year ago on mentorship. So if you look at my name and Compton, you can find it on the internet. It was published in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. And so, but basically, the idea is that mentoring is a mutual relationship between the two people. The mentee brings qualities to the relationship, and the mentor brings qualities to the relationship. And there is research that people who have had a mentor tend to be more successful in their careers after they leave college than the people who have not had a mentor. So I think you have to take the initiative. I did that when I was in college and in graduate school, and after I finished my education, I would write to people whose books that I read and introduce myself and try to get to know them as a person. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but I would encourage people to take the initiative.
I've been often told to smile to help myself feel happier. Does this actually work?
Yes, there is some research on that, that you change the muscles in your body, the brain responds that way. Not simply the smile, but your body language, how you walk, how you stand. Yeah, we are influenced by this, and it is worth cultivating. We're very sensitive to this. We all are. This is called nonverbal communication, and we form impressions very quickly of other people. It happens in 10 seconds, 20 seconds, and we can change this. Often this is not taught by therapists in psychology, it's a branch of speech language therapy. There are people who specialize in helping business people to develop better posture, better communication skills. And it works. In business, people would not be paying lots of money if it didn't work. They learn to chair meetings better. They learn to show more sensitivity to the people they manage, to come off as more dynamic. These are things that can be learned. I think the Rambam would have said that, but it's our responsibility to develop this. I'll just say there's a lot of interest now, and this is my field, is with children, as you know, that's my specialty. children who have low self-esteem, sometimes ADHD, and have trouble focusing. An adjunct often now is getting them involved in a martial art, karate, aikido, yoga. Yoga is not a martial art, but it's a body-oriented system, and it helps develop physical confidence. And I've seen this, and I recommend it. It doesn't replace other kinds of intervention, but it's a very useful adjunct because many of these kids, and it can be teenagers and adults, have low self-esteem, and they project that in their physical interactions with other people.
You have a lot of questions, so I hope we have time to cover them.
I'll do my best.
Okay. I mean, if people need to leave, Phil, but as long as you have time, we'll keep going. How profound of a negative effect do you think there has been on morality in America by removing religion and God from the public sphere and in the schools?
Oh, I think that's a very relevant question, and I think it has had a negative impact. I believe it does. And I was a kid when this happened. There was a period when the compromise was called a moment of silence or a taking out of the kid from the public school, and would have some kind of brief spiritual activity. And that was thrown out by the Supreme Court when I was a kid and a teenager. So I think in part we are seeing the impact of that in our society.
Mhm. Try to go back in time here. How would someone who uses anger to obtain the natural dopamine high they receive replace that same, I can't read this. It's getting blocked somehow. I guess
Yeah.
how do they replace that with a happiness feeling?
Well, this is what people are trained to do if they have anger. You've all heard the term anger management problems. And again, part of this is temperament. We differ on this. Some people never get angry, and some people are always angry. So and I've trained people in this in my clinical work. You teach them to substitute a different kind of feeling uh, for the feeling of anger and to monitor themselves. Some of this is now done with smartphones. You can monitor your feelings much better now. That's one of the positive features of smartphones. There are lots and lots of negative features, but it's easier to self monitor your mood now than it was before. And so for people, and it's not the average person, but people who have serious problems with anger, this way they can learn to monitor when they're starting to get angry and to substitute that feeling with a positive emotion. Now, we know we don't have time tonight, but Seligman really has to be commended because in the beginning of the field, and still, he emphasized the importance of gratitude. And in the founding, and I've emphasized this in my books on positive psychology, it's been said if you want to work on one thing to be a happier person, you should become a more grateful person, a more thankful person. And again, going back to the Rambam, you cultivate this feeling of gratitude. And there are different activities. We're almost out of time, but one of the classic activities that Seligman developed is at the end of the day, you write down, you have to keep a journal. Some of us loved that. I'm a writer. I always write, but some people don't like writing particularly. But it's very useful to keep a journal. And at the end of the day, and you don't have to show this to anyone, this is private. You write down about 3 things that you're grateful for that happened during the day. Again, it's little things. So yesterday, when I drove to Yeshiva college, the traffic was not terrible. It was just normal. There were no major accidents. So I would write that down, that I was grateful for that. So if you follow me, again, my point earlier in the lecture is the little things make a difference. So you write about 3 things that you're grateful for that happened during the day. And it's been found, some of you may know, most of the research is done with college students because they're a captive audience. In order to get their degrees, psychology majors have to participate in a certain amount of research, or it's easy to get them to volunteer. But they find if you do this activity for a certain number of days, usually just a few weeks, it boosts your level of gratitude. It seems more or less permanently. 6 months later, and we can measure gratitude pretty well. We have surveys that will measure how grateful you are in your daily personality. So if you develop gratitude, you'll be less angry. You can't be angry and grateful at the same time. So this is one, and then I'll mention another, which is called the gratitude visit. I find this very touching, very beautiful, maybe reflecting my background, my parents both being teachers and so forth. You find someone in your life that you are thankful for. It has to be someone who's living. It doesn't mean that their soul doesn't exist, but you know, positive psychology doesn't get into that realm yet. So you find someone who's still alive that you're grateful to. It could be a former teacher, a former clergy, a rabbi, a minister, a neighbor. There are many, many people we have growing up, a professor, and you visit that person if possible. And we live in a very big world now, technologically, but it's better if it's not done through email or Zoom. I feel it should be in person. And you give them a letter that you've written about how that person has made a difference to you in your life. And you shouldn't just suddenly drop in. Yeah, you would tell them that I feel this gratitude towards you, and I'd like to personally thank you for your influence on my life. And it can also have a very big impact on you. It's called a gratitude visit. You have to be a little careful because some people may be overwhelmed by it. So you have to think it through. You'd ask permission to do this. It could be a relative also, but this also seems to have a very positive impact on our sense of gratitude.
Do we have time for 2 more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Positive psychology discusses the idea of happy habits. Is there one specific habit or skill that you would say is most powerful?
Well, yeah, that's a very important question. That would go back to this notion of gratitude is probably the most important thing. If you can work on one thing, it would be gratitude.
That makes sense because that flows into everything else. And what are your thoughts on positive reinforcement of social skills? Example, praising a shy student when he or she speaks up.
Yeah, Adler talked about this. Um, Adler was the founder of teacher training in this country. He felt that teachers had a very important role to influence children. And that was true in my case. I had a teacher in high school, social studies. I was his student for 2 years. I also worked as his assistant. Um, and he was my first mentor. I dedicated 2 of my books to his memory. He died at a young age, around age 50. My father liked him very much. They both were at the Bronx High School of Science. Um, so I think it's very important to cultivate mentors and to be thankful for mentors in our life. We always can develop new mentors. Um, and going back to your question, that's where social skills come in. I learned how to work with other people through having him as a mentor. He was very praising of my abilities. And I think every good teacher, every good professor has the ability to bring students out of their shells, to recognize their talents, and very importantly, to help them see their talents and appreciate their own talents. We often don't see this, and a good teacher, a good mentor helps us to recognize our best abilities.
Okay, I know I said only two, but there's one person that
Okay,
really
we'll
wants
take
to ask.
one more.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
How did you go about researching Rambam's works? What was the process for this unusual research such as this?
All right, thank you for that's a good question to end on. There have been books written by medical doctors about the Rambam's place in the history of medicine, but I wrote this book, it was about 12, 13 years ago. I noticed that there had never been a book written by a psychologist about the Rambam. And I don't like, as a professor at Yeshiva University, as a writer, I don't like to repeat what other people do. I just don't find that interesting or meaningful to me. So I felt that would be a very nice challenge, would be to pull together everything I could and see what he had to say about psychology, in particular positive psychology, what I've been talking about with you in the audience this evening. Now, my Hebrew is not great. I don't think I'm great with languages. So I used books in English, everything I could find that he wrote that has been translated into English. And I did check with some scholars to make sure that these were accurate translations. And then I just went through all of the comments that I found interesting and significant. And I found hundreds of these. Each one I put on a page. And then I began to organize them into broad topics. So I mentioned one was called Becoming a Sage. One had to do with higher states of consciousness. One had to do with social skills and so forth. And I was fortunate to get a good publisher who was interested in the topic. And so I had a contract very quickly, and that gave me the incentive to get a deadline for this and to really focus on it. So I'm very happy with what I achieved with that book. Yeah.
Well, speaking of gratitude, we're very grateful that you gave us your time and
Thank you.
that you did this research. And I just hope you're successful in future endeavors because you really
Thank
have a
you.
lot to offer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you all for coming. There will be a recording, so we will send that to all of you who registered.
And I want to wish all of you a happy and healthy new year coming up. Okay.
Thank you. Amen.
Good night.
You take care.